The morning Delilah Rose's father died, 7 traveling men showed up at her door with holes in their socks and coins in their hands, unaware that the man who usually greeted them with coffee and conversation lay cold in his bed upstairs. She was 22 years old that September morning in 1882, standing in the doorway of their modest house on the edge of Bozeman, Montana territory, wondering how she would tell these weathered strangers that Samuel Rose had passed in his sleep, and that their monthly tradition of sock darning had come to an end. But when she opened her mouth to speak, the oldest of the men, a silver-haired prospector named Gil, saw the redness around her eyes and the black armband already pinned to her sleeve, and he simply removed his hat and said they would come back another time. Delilah heard herself say something she had not planned, words that came from a place of desperate practicality rather than grief, though grief was surely drowning her from the inside. "I can darn them," she said. "My father taught me. I can do the work." The men exchanged glances, uncertain, but Gil nodded slowly and reached into his pocket for the customary payment. Her father had charged 15 cents per pair, enough to buy flour and coffee, and the lamp oil that let him work into the evening hours when his carpentry jobs ran scarce. Delilah took the coins and the socks and told the men to return in 3 days. When she closed the door, she stood in the empty house that still smelled of her father's pipe tobacco and let herself cry for exactly 5 minutes by the mantel clock. Then she wiped her face, built up the fire, and began to work. The funeral was simple because her father had been a simple man, a widower who had raised his daughter alone after consumption took her mother when Delilah was barely old enough to remember her face. The small cemetery on the hill overlooking Bozeman filled with autumn light that afternoon, golden and bittersweet, and the preacher said kind words about Samuel Rose's honest craftsmanship and generous spirit. Neighbors brought food that Delilah could not eat, and she thanked them with a voice that sounded like someone else's, distant and hollow. When the last visitor left and the house fell silent again, she returned to the basket of socks by the fire and continued her darning, the needle moving in and out of worn wool in the pattern her father had shown her since childhood. 3 days later, the 7 men returned. Gil inspected her work with the critical eye of someone who had walked thousands of miles in his lifetime and needed his socks to hold. He ran his weathered fingers over the tight, even stitches and nodded his approval. The other men examined their pairs as well, and one by one, they each added an extra nickel to her hand, a small kindness that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Word spread quickly in a town like Bozeman. By the following week, 12 more traveling men appeared at her door. By the end of October, she was darning socks for nearly 30 regular customers, men who worked the mines in the mountains, drove cattle across the territories, scouted for the army, or simply drifted from place to place with restless hearts and worn-out footwear. She developed a system, writing each man's name on a slip of paper pinned to his socks, organizing them by promised completion date. Her days began before dawn and ended long after dark, her fingers moving constantly, the needle and thread becoming extensions of her own body. The work was tedious and endless, but it was also hypnotic, and in the rhythm of darning she found a strange comfort, a way to keep moving forward when grief threatened to pull her under. The money was enough to pay for food and firewood, and the mortgage her father had taken on the house 5 years earlier. Just barely enough, but enough. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with bitter winds and heavy snow. The town of Bozeman huddled against the cold, smoke rising from every chimney, icicles hanging like crystal daggers from every roof edge. Delilah's front room became a gathering place of sorts, travelers stopping in to drop off or collect their mended socks, stamping snow from their boots and warming their hands by her fire for a few minutes before heading back out into the frozen world. She learned their names and their stories, became familiar with their patterns. Gil the prospector came monthly like clockwork. A cattle driver named Dutch visited whenever his route brought him through. 3 Army scouts made regular appearances, and a handful of railroad workers showed up every other week, their socks shredded by long days of laying track across unforgiving terrain. It was on a particularly brutal day in late December when Lucas Kane first appeared at her door. The blizzard had been raging for 2 days straight, the wind howling like a wounded animal, snow piling in drifts that reached the windowsills. Delilah had not expected any visitors and was startled by the heavy knock that rattled her door frame. When she opened it, a wall of snow and wind tried to force its way inside, and behind it stood a man so covered in frost and ice that he looked like a winter spirit made flesh. He stumbled across her threshold when she pulled him in, and she had to throw her full weight against the door to close it again. "Thank you," he managed through chattering teeth. His voice was deep and rough, scraped raw by the cold. "Saw your light. Would have frozen if I had gone another mile." She helped him to the chair nearest the fire, her practical nature overriding any nervousness about having a strange man in her home. He was in genuine danger, she could see that clearly. His lips were blue, his hands clumsy and unresponsive. She piled more wood on the fire and brought him a quilt to wrap around his shoulders, then heated water for coffee, her movements efficient and calm despite the unusual situation. As the warmth of the room slowly brought him back to life, she got her first good look at him. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly when wet and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like winter sky just before a storm. His face was angular and weathered by sun and wind, with a few days' worth of dark stubble along his jaw. He was tall, she could tell even with him sitting, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for his living. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn denim and leather, spurs still attached to his boots, a wide-brimmed hat now dripping melted snow onto her floor. "I am Lucas Kane," he said after he had managed a few sips of hot coffee. "I was trying to reach the Patterson Ranch before the storm hit, miscalculated badly." "Patterson Ranch is another 8 miles north," Delilah told him, refilling his cup. "You would not have made it. I realize that now." He looked at her directly, and she saw intelligence in those storm-colored eyes, along with embarrassment at his predicament. "I am grateful for your help. I will not impose on your hospitality long, just until the storm breaks." "The storm will last through tomorrow at least," she said, glancing at the window where snow pressed thick against the glass. "I have seen enough Montana winters to recognize a 3-day blow." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I cannot ask you to shelter me that long. It would not be proper. Is there a hotel I could reach in this weather? You would be dead before you made it 20 yards. No, you will stay here. I have my father's room. He passed in September, so it stands empty." She said it matter-of-factly, though speaking of her father's death still felt like pressing on a bruise. "You may sleep there. I will keep to my own room. There is a lock if it makes you feel safer." A ghost of a smile crossed his face at that. "I think you are the one who should be worried about safety, Miss Rose." "It is Miss Rose, then. You know my name. Gil spoke of you when I was working the northern ranges last month. Said Samuel Rose's daughter had taken over his sock darning business and was doing fine work. Half the traveling men in the territory seemed to know about you." Delilah was not sure how she felt about being a topic of conversation among strangers, but she supposed it made sense. Word of mouth was how her father had built his small business, and it was how she was maintaining it. She told Lucas Kane that he was welcome to the room, and that she would make supper once he had properly thawed out and changed into dry clothes. He accepted with quiet gratitude, and she showed him to the small bedroom that had been her father's, where she had already removed most of the personal items but left the furniture and bedding. While he changed, she prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, her mind working through the strangeness of the situation. She was alone in her house with a man she had never met before, something her father would have been deeply uncomfortable with. But her father was gone, and the alternative had been to let Lucas Kane freeze to death on her doorstep, which was no alternative at all. She would simply have to trust that he was an honorable man, and if he proved otherwise, well, she kept her father's revolver loaded in the drawer of her bedside table. When Lucas emerged from the bedroom in dry clothes, his hair toweled and his color returned to normal, she was struck by how the firelight softened his weathered features. He had a good face, she decided, strong but not harsh, with a certain openness in his expression that put her somewhat at ease. They ate supper at her small table, the wind screaming outside, the house creaking under the assault of the blizzard. "This is excellent," Lucas said, gesturing to his plate. "I have been living on hardtack and jerky for 3 weeks straight. Where are you coming from?" She asked, curious despite herself. "Down from the high country. I have been working cattle for a ranch out of Virginia City, but the owner sold his herd and I found myself looking for new employment. Heard the Patterson Ranch was hiring for the winter, so I started north." He took another bite of cornbread. "Now I am wondering if I should have waited until spring." "Montana winters do not wait for convenient timing," Delilah said. "They arrive when they please and leave when they are done with us." He laughed at that, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small room. "That is the truth. You are from here, then, born in Bozeman," born in Virginia, actually. "My parents brought me west when I was 4 years old. My father was a carpenter and heard there was work to be had in the growing towns. My mother wanted adventure, or so he told me. She died when I was 7, and after that it was just the two of us. I am sorry for your loss, both of them." His sympathy sounded genuine, not the empty condolences she had endured from people who barely knew her father. "Thank you. What about you? Where is your family?" Something shifted in his expression, a brief shadow. "My father died in the war. My mother passed 2 years later when I was 17. I have been on my own since then, working ranches, driving cattle, doing whatever work I could find. I have a sister somewhere back in Kansas, married with children, but we have not spoken in years. Different lives." They fell into an easy conversation after that, trading stories about the hard realities of Western life, the beauty and brutality of the land, the strange characters they had encountered. Delilah found herself relaxing in his presence, surprised by how natural it felt to talk with him. Most of the men who came to her door were polite but distant, treating the transaction as pure business. Lucas Kane was different, more open, genuinely interested in her responses. When she mentioned her sock darning work, he looked at the basket by the fire with new understanding. "That must be steady work," he observed. "Traveling men are always hard on their socks." "It keeps me fed and warm," she replied. "My father started it years ago when his carpentry work slowed down. He had learned the skill from his own father, who was a tailor in Philadelphia. He enjoyed the work, said it gave him time to think. I find the same thing. There is something meditative about the repetition, the way you can lose yourself in the rhythm of it." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose it is like riding fence line or night watch. Work that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy." "Exactly that," she said, pleased that he understood. After supper, Lucas insisted on helping her clean the dishes despite her protests. They worked side by side at her wash basin, the domesticity of the moment striking them both into a brief, awkward silence. When everything was put away, Delilah returned to her basket of socks and Lucas asked if he might sit by the fire and watch her work, as he had nowhere else to be and no desire to retire early. She agreed, and they settled into a comfortable arrangement, her in her father's old darning chair, Lucas in the other seat, both of them listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled between them. "How did you learn to darn so well?" Lucas asked after watching her for several minutes. "Those stitches are remarkably even. Practice, mostly. My father started teaching me when I was 8 or 9. He said it was an important skill, that I should know how to maintain my own things without depending on others. He taught me carpentry basics too, and how to shoot, and how to manage household accounts. He believed women should be self-sufficient." She smiled at the memory. Some of the neighbors thought he was radical for it, teaching his daughter such things. "Sounds like a wise man to me." Self-sufficiency is survival out here. Gender seems less important than capability when you are facing down winter with limited resources. "I wish more people shared that view," Delilah said quietly. She had faced more than a few raised eyebrows and dismissive comments since her father's death. People who thought a young, unmarried woman living alone was improper at best, scandalous at worst. The fact that she was running a business, even such a modest one, only added to their disapproval. "The world is changing," Lucas said. "Slowly, but it is changing. I have known plenty of women who could outwork, outshoot, and outthink most men. My own mother ran our family farm for 2 years while my father was off fighting, kept it profitable too, which he never managed." They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Delilah learned that Lucas had worked ranches from Texas to Montana, that he could play fiddle a little but not well, that he had once tracked a wounded bear for 3 days through a snowstorm to put it out of its misery. He learned that she could recite entire passages of poetry from memory, that she had taught herself to read music from an old primer, though she had no instrument to practice on, that she dreamed sometimes of traveling to San Francisco just to see the ocean. When the mantel clock struck 11, they both startled, surprised by how quickly the time had passed. "I should let you rest," Lucas said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for the conversation, and the shelter and the food. You have saved my life today." "You are welcome," Delilah said, meaning it. "Sleep well. I will make breakfast in the morning." Alone in her room, door locked more from habit than fear, Delilah lay awake longer than usual, her mind replaying the evening's conversations. There was something about Lucas Kane that unsettled her, though not in a frightening way. It was more that he made her aware of her own loneliness, the way his presence had filled the house with warmth and life in a way that simply feeding the fire never could. She told herself not to be foolish, that he was just a stranger taking shelter from a storm, that he would be gone the moment the weather cleared. But some part of her, a part she had kept carefully locked away since her father's death, hoped the storm might last a little longer. The blizzard continued through the next day and the day after that, just as Delilah had predicted. The world outside became a white void, snow falling so thick and fast that she could not see the fence at the edge of her property. The two of them settled into an unexpected routine. Lucas proved useful around the house, splitting firewood from her covered pile, shoveling snow away from the door when it drifted too high, repairing a loose hinge on her kitchen cabinet that she had been meaning to fix for weeks. She cooked meals they ate together at the small table, and in the evenings, They sat by the fire while she darned socks, and he told stories about his years on the trail. On the second full day of his stay, Lucas noticed a pair of socks drying by the fire that had a hole worn straight through the heel, beyond any reasonable repair. He picked them up, examining them with a frown. "Whose are these?" he asked. "Mine," Delilah admitted, a little embarrassed. "I have been meaning to darn them, but I always seem to prioritize the paying work. I will get to them eventually." Lucas looked at her worn socks, then at the basket overflowing with other men's mending, and something in his expression shifted. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the socks over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was soft but serious. "You darn socks for every traveling man in the territory, but you cannot spare time to mend your own. That does not seem right." "It is just the way of things," she said with a shrug, threading her needle with practiced efficiency. "The paying work comes first. What if someone darned yours for you? Would you accept that?" She looked up at him, surprised. "I suppose I would, though I cannot imagine why anyone would offer." Lucas sat down across from her, still holding her socks. Teach me to darn these for you. You want to learn to darn socks?" She could not keep the incredulity from her voice. "Why not? You said it yourself, it is an important skill, self-sufficiency and all that." His gray-blue eyes held her steadily. "Besides, it seems only fair. You have given me shelter and food for 2 days now. Let me do something useful in return." Delilah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, pull your chair closer and I will show you." Teaching Lucas Kane to darn socks was an exercise in patience on both their parts. His hands, so capable with rope and leather, fumbled with the delicate needle and thread. He pricked his finger twice in the first 5 minutes and cursed under his breath, making Delilah laugh despite herself. But he was determined, watching her demonstrations carefully and practicing the basic stitches with stubborn persistence. By the end of the evening, he had managed a clumsy but functional repair on one of her socks, the stitches uneven and too loose, but holding nonetheless. "It is terrible," he announced, holding up his work for inspection. "It is a first attempt," Delilah corrected, taking the sock from him. "And it will keep my foot warmer than the hole would have." "Thank you, Lucas." He smiled at that, pleased despite his critique of his own work. "I will do better with the next one, if you will let me try again tomorrow." "If we are still snowed in tomorrow, I will let you try again," she agreed. That night, lying in her bed listening to the wind howl, Delilah found herself thinking about the care Lucas had taken with her worn socks, the seriousness with which he had approached the task. It was such a small thing, but it touched her in a way she had not expected. She thought about his calloused hands struggling with the needle, his determination to learn something new just to help her. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words mattered. She thought about how alive the house felt with him in it, how the loneliness that had been her constant companion since September had retreated into the corners. She was in danger, she realized. Danger of caring too much, too quickly, for a man who would leave the moment the weather cleared. It was foolish and reckless, but her heart seemed not to care about logic. It wanted what it wanted, and what it wanted was increasingly clear. On the third morning, she woke to silence. The wind had stopped. She rose and went to her window, pulling back the curtain to see a world transformed. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind clear skies of brilliant blue and snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early sun. It was breathtakingly beautiful and absolutely devastating, because it meant Lucas would leave. She made breakfast in a kind of daze, her movements mechanical. When Lucas emerged from her father's room, he went straight to the window and stood there for a long moment, taking in the changed weather. "It cleared," he said unnecessarily. "Yes." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. They ate breakfast in near silence, the easy conversation of the previous days replaced by an awkward heaviness. Delilah wanted to say something, anything, to break through it, but she could not find the words. What could she say? Please do not go. Stay here with me in this small house and darn socks for the rest of your life. It was absurd. He had his own path, his own plans. The Patterson ranch was waiting for him. After the meal, Lucas gathered his things, his movements slow, reluctant. He packed his saddlebag with the careful attention of someone trying to delay the inevitable. Delilah stood by the fire, ostensibly organizing her sock basket, but really just trying to keep her hands busy so they would not shake. When he was ready, Lucas came to stand before her. The sun streaming through the window lit his dark hair and cast shadows across his angular face. He looked like he was wrestling with something, words trying to fight their way out. Delilah, he began, then stopped, started again. These 3 days have been, well, they have meant something to me. More than just shelter from a storm. Her heart beat faster. They have meant something to me too. I do not want to leave, he said simply, but I have no reason to stay. I need the work at Patterson Ranch. I need the wages. I have no home, no property, nothing to offer anyone, especially not someone like you who has her own life established here. I understand, she said, though understanding did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of socks, his own, worn thin at the heels. He held them out to her with both hands like an offering. Will you darn these for me? He asked. I will pay you, of course, the usual rate. And I will come back to collect them in 2 weeks when I next have a day away from the ranch, if that would be acceptable to you. Delilah took the socks, clutching them perhaps more tightly than necessary. That would be acceptable. I will have them ready. Good. He smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. I will look forward to it. He moved toward the door, and Delilah followed, her mind racing. This could not be how it ended, with polite words and a promise to return that might or might not be kept. She had to say something, had to take some kind of chance, even if it made her vulnerable. Lucas, wait. The words came out more forcefully than she intended. He turned back, hope flickering across his face. She took a breath, steadying herself. I have an idea. It might be forward of me. It might be too much, but I want to say it anyway. Please do, he said quietly. You said you have nothing to offer, but that is not exactly true. You have skills, a strong back, a good mind. And I have a house and a business, small as it is, but stable income. Neither of us wants you to leave. I can see that as clearly as you can. So what if there was an arrangement that benefited both of us? Lucas stepped away from the door, moving closer to her. What kind of arrangement? I need help, Delilah said, the words coming faster now. The darning work is more than I can manage alone. I have been turning people away because I do not have enough hours in the day. If you stayed, if you learned the skill properly, we could take on more work, earn more money. We could be partners in the business. You would have steady employment and a place to live. I would have help and company. She faltered slightly on that last word but held his gaze. It would be practical for both of us. Practical, Lucas repeated, and there was something in his tone she could not quite read. Is that the only reason you want me to stay? Practicality? No, she admitted, her face flushing. No, that is not the only reason. But it is the reason that makes sense, the reason I can offer without completely humiliating myself. A slow smile spread across Lucas's face, genuine and warm and entirely transforming. Delilah Rose, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met. Yes. Yes, I will stay. I will learn to darn socks properly if it kills me, and I will be your partner in business. And maybe, if you are willing, we can see if we might be partners in other ways too, in time. If that is something you would want. I would want that, she said, her own smile breaking through like sun after storm. I would want that very much. Lucas laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and closed the distance between them. He took her hands in his, socks and all, and held them gently. Then it is settled. You darn socks for traveling men, and I will darn yours, for life, if you will have me. And I promise I will do everything in my power to keep you warm in whatever way you need. That is quite a promise, Delilah said, her voice thick with emotion. I am quite serious about it, Lucas replied. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her softly. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a beginning rather than an ending. When they parted, both of them were smiling, and the future that had seemed so bleak and lonely just moments before now stretched out bright with possibility. The first few weeks of their partnership were an adjustment for them both. Lucas moved his few belongings into her father's old room, maintaining propriety despite their obvious feelings for each other. He proved to be a dedicated student of sock darning, practicing for hours each day, until his stitches began to approach the evenness and tightness of Delilah's own work. His hands, though large and calloused, had a surprising deftness once he got the hang of it, and he took genuine pride in mastering the skill. Word spread through Bozeman that Delilah Rose had taken on a partner, and the gossip was predictable and occasionally unkind. But the disapproval of the town's more conservative residents was balanced by increased business from traveling men, who appreciated the faster turnaround time now that two people were working. By February, they were handling nearly 60 regular customers, and Delilah had to order more thread and darning eggs from the general store. Lucas proved invaluable in ways beyond just the darning work. He was naturally friendly and put customers at ease, remembering their names and details about their lives, asking follow-up questions about jobs and families. He reinforced the back fence, repaired the roof where it had been leaking, and convinced Delilah to let him build additional shelving for their growing supply inventory. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and work together in companionable silence, or talk about their days, or read aloud from books. It was a quiet, domestic happiness that Delilah had not known she craved until she had it. Their relationship deepened gradually, naturally, like ice melting in spring. Lucas courted her properly despite living under the same roof, bringing her small gifts when he went to town, complimenting her work, finding excuses to make her laugh. They held hands while walking to church on Sundays, shared longer kisses goodnight at her bedroom door, spoke in careful terms about a future together that was becoming more certain with each passing day. In March, on an evening when the world outside was beginning to thaw and the first hints of spring were visible in patches of exposed brown grass, Lucas asked Delilah to marry him. They were sitting by the fire as usual, their hands busy with their work, when he simply set down his needle and thread and turned to her. "I think we should get married," he said, as casually as if he were suggesting they have stew for dinner. Delilah looked up from the sock she was darning, needle paused mid-stitch. "That is quite possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of proposals." Lucas grinned, not even slightly embarrassed. "Would you prefer I get down on one knee and make a flowery speech?" "I would prefer you ask me properly, yes." "Fair enough." He stood, took her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. Then, to her surprise and delight, he actually did drop to one knee, looking up at her with those storm-colored eyes full of warmth and mischief and genuine love. "Delilah Rose, you are my partner, my best friend, the person I want to wake up next to every morning and fall asleep beside every night. You have given me a home and a purpose and a happiness I did not know existed. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, of course I will marry you." He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Gil and a few other regular customers serving as witnesses. Delilah wore a dress of deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and Lucas borrowed a proper suit from the general store owner. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials life might bring. The wedding night was spent in the house that was now truly theirs together, not just hers with him as a guest. Lucas carried her over the threshold, even though she protested that it was unnecessary, and they moved his belongings from her father's old room into hers. They made love for the first time with tenderness and patience, learning each other's bodies as they had learned each other's minds and hearts, and afterward lay tangled together in the darkness, talking in whispers about their dreams for the future. "I want children," Delilah said softly, her head resting on his chest. "At least 2 or 3. I hated being an only child after my mother died. I want our children to have siblings, to have each other." "I want that too," Lucas agreed, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "A house full of children. We will teach them to be self-sufficient and kind and to darn their own socks." She laughed at that. "The most practical legacy imaginable, practical and romantic," he corrected. "That is who we are." The months that followed their marriage were full of work and laughter and deepening love. Their sock-darning business continued to grow, their reputation for quality and reliability spreading across the territory. They hired a local widow, Mrs. Chen, to help with the overflow work, paying her fair wages and teaching her the techniques. The 3 of them formed an efficient team, handling upwards of 80 regular customers by summer. Lucas proved to have a good head for business. He suggested they expand their services to include other mending work, not just socks, but torn shirts and pants and canvas coats. He negotiated a deal with the general store to sell their services there, bringing in customers who might not have otherwise known about them. He kept careful accounts and found ways to reduce costs on supplies without sacrificing quality. Under his guidance, the modest business that had barely sustained Delilah alone became genuinely profitable. By autumn, they had saved enough money to make significant improvements to the house. They added a proper workshop room where they could work more comfortably, with better light and more storage. They replaced the old cookstove with a newer model that heated more efficiently. They purchased a piano on a payment plan, and Lucas surprised Delilah by revealing that he could actually play quite well, despite his earlier claims of having only a little skill. She would sit beside him on the bench while he played, her head on his shoulder, and feel a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. In December, a year after Lucas had first stumbled through her door in a blizzard, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. She told him on Christmas morning, her gift to him wrapped in words rather than paper. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around the room, both of them laughing like children, and then he gently set her down and placed his hand on her still flat stomach with a wonder that brought tears to her eyes. "Our child," he said softly. "We are going to have a child." "We are," she confirmed. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Lucas said. "I am grateful. I am blessed. I am terrified. I am more in love with you than I thought possible, and I did not think I could love you more than I already did." The pregnancy was relatively easy, for which Delilah was grateful. She continued working throughout, her hands as steady as ever with needle and thread even as her body changed and grew. Lucas became almost comically protective, constantly worried that she was doing too much, trying to take on more of the work himself. She had to remind him repeatedly that pregnancy was not an illness and that she was perfectly capable of darning socks while growing a human being. Their son was born on a warm July evening in 1884, delivered by the town's doctor with Lucas present, despite the physician's protests that the birthing room was no place for a husband. Lucas held Delilah's hand through the whole ordeal, whispering encouragement and love, and when their baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, he wept openly. They named him Samuel, after Delilah's father, with Lucas as his middle name. Sam was a healthy, happy baby with his mother's dark eyes and his father's already evident stubbornness. He was just over a month old when Gil came by to collect his mended socks and stood over the cradle with a fond smile. "Your father would have been proud," the old prospector told Delilah. "Proud of the business you built, proud of the man you married, proud of this little one. You honored his memory well." "Thank you, Gil," Delilah said, touched by his words. "That means a great deal to me." Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Their work continued, though they had to adjust their schedule around Sam's needs. Lucas proved to be a natural father, comfortable with the baby in a way that surprised them both. He would strap Sam to his chest in a sling Delilah sewed and work one-handed, singing softly to keep the baby content. Customers became accustomed to the sight of Lucas Kane darning socks with an infant attached to him, and more than one commented that it was the most peculiar and heartwarming thing they had ever witnessed. When Sam was 6 months old, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with equal joy but less surprise. They had always wanted multiple children close in age, and nature was cooperating with their plans. Their daughter Margaret, called Maggie from day one, arrived in the spring of 1885, a tiny red-haired sprite who seemed to have inherited both her parents' determination and her brother's healthy lungs. With 2 small children and a growing business, the house began to feel cramped. Lucas used some of their savings to purchase the adjacent lot, and he spent his spare time that year building an addition to the house, expanding their living space and creating a dedicated workshop separate from their home. Friends and customers helped with the construction, the community coming together in the way frontier towns often did, and by autumn, they had nearly doubled their space. The work continued to grow. They had established themselves as the premier mending service in Bozeman, and traveling men would sometimes go out of their way to stop there, knowing the quality they would receive. Mrs. Chen had trained 2 other women to help with the work, and the small business that had started with Delilah darning socks by her fireplace to pay her mortgage had become a legitimate enterprise employing 5 people. But despite their success, despite the money they were making and the comfortable life they had built, Lucas and Delilah never forgot the core of what they did. They still charged fair prices, still remembered their customers' names and stories, still took pride in each perfectly darned sock. And every evening when the work was done and the children were asleep, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes working, sometimes just talking, always grateful for the storm that had brought them together. As the years passed, their family continued to grow. Another son, James, arrived in 1887, followed by a daughter named Clara in 1889. The house expanded again to accommodate them all. Sam grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and showed an early aptitude for mathematics. Maggie was wild and fearless, constantly getting into trouble and charming her way out of it again. James was gentle and artistic, always drawing pictures or making up elaborate stories. Clara, the baby, seemed to have inherited the best traits of all her siblings, equally comfortable with books or adventures or quiet observation. Lucas taught all the children to ride and rope and shoot, just as Delilah taught them to read and cipher and darn their own socks. They grew up understanding the value of work and self-sufficiency, but also kindness and community. The house was always full of noise and laughter and occasional tears, the beautiful chaos of a large and loving family. In the early spring of 1891, Gil stopped coming by to collect his socks. They heard through other travelers that he had died peacefully in his sleep at a mining camp in the mountains, an old man who had lived exactly the life he wanted. Delilah and Lucas attended the small memorial service held for him in Bozeman, and afterward, Delilah placed his last pair of darned socks in a box with her father's things, two men who had shaped her life in different but important ways. The business continued to evolve with the changing times. As more settlers arrived in Montana, and the territory began its slow transformation toward statehood, the number of traveling men began to decrease slightly. Lucas anticipated this shift and gradually expanded their services, taking on more general tailoring and repair work, even beginning to make new garments from scratch. They hired a trained seamstress and invested in better equipment. The sock darning remained their specialty and their legacy, but it was no longer their only source of income. By 1893, Montana had achieved statehood, and Bozeman had grown from a frontier town into a more established community. The wild, rough edges were being worn smooth by civilization. Schools and churches and civic organizations replacing saloons and gambling halls, though plenty of both still remained. Lucas and Delilah found themselves respected members of the community, their business success and large family marking them as stable, reliable citizens. One evening in the fall of that year, after the children were all in bed and the house finally quiet, Lucas and Delilah sat together in their usual spot by the fire. They were not working for once, just sitting close together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They had been married for 8 years, together for nearly 10, and the comfort between them was as deep and natural as breathing. "Do you ever think about that blizzard?" Lucas asked quietly. "The day I showed up half frozen at your door, all the time," Delilah admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if that storm had not happened, or if I had not opened the door, or if you had made it to Patterson Ranch before the weather turned. It terrifies me, honestly, how much of our happiness depended on circumstance and chance." "I do not think it was just chance," Lucas said thoughtfully. "I think we were meant to find each other, maybe not in any grand cosmic sense, but in the sense that we were both ready for what we found. You needed help and companionship. I needed a home and purpose. We were prepared to recognize the gift when it appeared." "That is a very romantic way of looking at it," Delilah said with a smile. "I am a romantic at heart. You know this." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But I am also practical. And practically speaking, marrying you was the best decision I ever made, the only decision that really mattered. I feel the same way. About you, I mean, about us." She lifted her head to look at him properly. "I love you, Lucas Kane. I loved you after 3 days of watching you fumble with a darning needle. I loved you when you promised to keep me warm. I love you now, even more than I did then, which I would not have thought possible." "I love you too," Lucas said, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that, if such things are possible." They kissed then, soft and slow and sweet, a reaffirmation of vows spoken years ago and promises kept every day since. When they finally retired to their bedroom, they made love with the comfortable familiarity of long practice, but also the tenderness and passion that had never faded, that grew stronger with each passing year. Life continued its steady forward march. The children grew and changed, developing into their own distinct people. Sam, now nearly 10, showed a keen interest in the business side of things, often helping his father with the accounts. Maggie, 8 years old, declared she wanted to be a traveling woman when she grew up, much to her mother's amused exasperation. James was 6 and spent most of his time drawing elaborate pictures of horses and mountains. Clara, just past her 2nd birthday, was a bright, curious toddler who got into everything. In 1895, Delilah gave birth to their 5th and final child, another son they named Thomas. Lucas was 40 years old by then, Delilah 35, and they agreed that 5 children were plenty, more than plenty, a house full of chaos and love and constant noise. Thomas was an easy baby, perhaps because he had no choice but to be adaptable with 4 older siblings constantly vying for attention. As the century drew toward its close, Lucas and Delilah found themselves in a position they had never imagined in those early days. They owned their home outright, the mortgage paid off years earlier. Their business was successful enough to employ 10 people regularly. Their children were healthy and thriving. They had money saved, investments made, a secure future built through hard work and partnership. But more than the material success, they had built a life of genuine happiness. Their marriage remained strong, built on friendship and respect and passionate love. They still made each other laugh daily. They still sought each other's counsel on decisions large and small. They still sat by the fire together in the evenings, though now they were more likely to be reviewing accounts or discussing the children's education than actually darning socks themselves. One day in the spring of 1899, a young cowboy came to their door with holes in his socks and coins in his hand. He could not have been more than 19, fresh-faced and nervous, new to Montana, and looking for work. Lucas welcomed him in, took his socks, and promised they would be ready in 2 days. As the young man was leaving, he paused in the doorway. "Can I ask you something, sir?" the cowboy said. "People in town told me you are the man to see for mending, but they also said something strange. They said you were a cowboy yourself once, but you stayed in Bozeman to darn socks. Is that true? And if so, why?" Lucas glanced over at Delilah, who was working at the large table they had built for their business, surrounded by neat piles of mended garments. She looked up at the question and smiled at him, the same smile that had captured his heart nearly 2 decades earlier. "It is true," Lucas told the young cowboy. "I did stay here to darn socks. As for why, well, that is simple enough. I met a woman who darned socks for traveling men, and I told her to darn mine for life, and I would keep her warm. Turns out it was the best promise I ever made." The cowboy looked confused by this answer, as if he expected something more profound or complicated. But Delilah laughed, a bright, joyful sound, and Lucas grinned at her, and the young man eventually shrugged and headed back out into the spring sunshine, probably thinking the couple was slightly crazy but harmless enough. After he left, Delilah came over to where Lucas stood by the door and slipped her arms around his waist. "You told him wrong," she said, her eyes dancing with amusement. "You asked me to darn your socks for life. You were the one who made the promise to keep me warm. Did I?" Memory gets fuzzy after all these years. Lucas pulled her closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "I suppose the details do not matter much. However it happened, we ended up here, together, and I have kept you warm, have I not?" "You have," Delilah agreed, "in every way that matters. I have never been cold a day since you stayed." "And I never will be again," Lucas said, As long as I can sit by a fire with you at the end of each day and count myself the luckiest man alive." They kissed there in the doorway of their workshop. Two middle-aged parents of 5 with work-roughened hands and silver beginning to thread through their hair, still as in love as they had been the day they met. Around them, their business hummed with activity, employees working efficiently at various tasks. Somewhere in the house, their children were creating some new chaos that would require parental intervention soon enough. But for this moment, they simply held each other, grateful beyond words for the life they had built together from a blizzard and a basket of socks and a simple promise to keep each other warm. The new century arrived with celebration and uncertainty, the whole world poised on the edge of dramatic changes. But in Bozeman, Montana, in a house that had been expanded twice to accommodate a growing family, Lucas and Delilah Kane continued their work and their life together. They darned socks for traveling men, though those men were fewer now and traveled differently. They raised their children with love and discipline and practical skills. They maintained a marriage that was both partnership and romance, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Sam, at 16, announced his intention to study business and economics at the new college in Bozeman. Maggie, 14, had channeled her adventurous spirit into horses and was training to become one of the few female ranchers in the territory. James, 12, showed artistic talent that his parents nurtured by arranging apprenticeship with a local painter. Clara, 10, was proving to be mechanically inclined, constantly taking things apart to see how they worked and usually managing to put them back together. Thomas, 5, was still young enough that his future remained open and undefined, though he showed early signs of inheriting his father's easy charm and his mother's quick mind. On their 20th wedding anniversary in March of 1904, Lucas and Delilah took the rare step of closing the business for a full day and taking a trip alone together, leaving the children in the capable hands of Mrs. Chen and her daughter. They rode out to a meadow in the foothills where wildflowers were just beginning to emerge from the retreating snow, spreading a blanket on a patch of early grass warmed by spring sun. 20 years, Delilah marveled, lying back to look at the impossibly blue sky. "It seems like both forever and no time at all. The best 20 years of my life," Lucas said, settling beside her. "The only 20 years that really mattered. Do you ever regret it? Giving up the cowboy life, settling down the way you did?" Lucas propped himself on one elbow to look down at her. "Not for a single second. Do you regret taking in a half-frozen stranger and teaching him to darn socks?" "Never," Delilah said firmly. "It was the second best thing I ever did." "Second best?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "What was the first?" "Saying yes when you asked me to marry you." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that time and weather had etched there, the gray at his temples, the crow's feet around his eyes. "Although I suppose the two things are connected. I could not have married you if I had not first taught you to darn socks." "The foundation of our marriage," Lucas said solemnly. "Sock darning." "Practical and romantic," Delilah reminded him, echoing his words from so many years ago. They spent the day talking and laughing and remembering, reliving 20 years of shared history. They talked about the hard times, the winter Sam was so sick with fever they thought they might lose him. The year the business nearly failed when a competitor tried to undercut their prices. The losses and scares and moments of doubt that every long marriage accumulates. But mostly they talked about the good times, the overwhelming majority of their years together. The first smile from each baby. The Christmas when Lucas had secretly learned to play Delilah's favorite song on the piano. The summer they had taken all the children camping and James had spotted a family of bears. the thousand small kindnesses and joys that made up a life fully lived. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Lucas pulled out a small package from his saddlebag and handed it to Delilah. "I got you something," he said. "It is not much, but it seemed appropriate." Delilah unwrapped the package to find a pair of socks, hand-darned with stitches so perfect and even they rivaled her own best work. She looked up at him, touched beyond words. "You darn me socks for our anniversary. I darn you socks for life," Lucas corrected gently. "That was always the promise. These are just a reminder that I am still keeping it." Delilah felt tears sting her eyes, the good kind of tears that came from being deeply moved. "I love you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much, Lucas Kane. I love you too, Delilah Kane. Always have, always will." They rode home as the stars began to emerge, arriving to a house full of chaos as their children descended on them with stories and complaints and demands for attention. It was loud and overwhelming and absolutely perfect. They settled everyone down, heard about the day's adventures and minor dramas, then finally managed to retire to their own room, exhausted but happy. The years continued to pass, marked by the normal milestones of a large and loving family. Sam went off to college and eventually returned to Bozeman to start his own business, a general store that competed successfully with the older establishments. Maggie bought a small ranch with money she had saved and help from her parents, becoming known throughout the region for her skill with horses. James moved to Helena to pursue his art, selling paintings to the growing number of wealthy people settling in Montana. Clara surprised everyone by enrolling in a technical school in Chicago, one of the first women accepted into their engineering program. Thomas, the youngest, stayed in Bozeman and eventually took over the family business when Lucas and Delilah decided to retire in 1912. By then, they were in their 50s, ready to slow down and enjoy their grandchildren, of which they had 7 and counting. They remained involved in the business in an advisory capacity, but the day-to-day operations passed to Thomas and his new wife, a smart young woman named Rachel who had learned tailoring from her mother. Retirement suited them both. They traveled a little, visiting their scattered children and seeing parts of the country they had only heard about before. But they always returned to Bozeman, to the house they had built and expanded and filled with love. They spent their days reading and gardening and spoiling their grandchildren. And every evening, as they had for more than 30 years, they sat together by the fire, sometimes working on small mending projects just to keep their hands busy, more often just talking or sitting in comfortable silence. In the spring of 1918, Lucas fell ill with pneumonia. He was 63 years old, strong and healthy for his age, but the illness hit him hard. Delilah nursed him through it with fierce determination, sitting by his bedside day and night, willing him to recover through sheer force of love. And he did recover, slowly regaining his strength over several weeks. When he was finally well enough to return to their normal routine, he held Delilah close and thanked her for not letting him go. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," she told him, trying to mask her fear with humor. "I darned your socks for life, remember? That is a binding contract." "The best contract ever made," Lucas agreed. They had 12 more good years together after that scare. Years of watching their children's children grow, of celebrating anniversaries and birthdays and holidays with a family that kept expanding. Years of quiet contentment, the kind that comes from a life well lived in the company of someone deeply loved. They remained active in their community, attending church and social events, maintaining friendships built over decades. They watched Bozeman continue to grow and change. automobiles replacing horses on many streets, electric lights replacing oil lamps, the modern world advancing steadily into their mountain valley. On a warm summer evening in July of 1930, Lucas and Delilah celebrated their 51st wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren, now numbering more than 20 in total, gathered at the house for a party that spilled from indoors out into the yard. There was food and music and laughter, generations mixing and mingling, telling and retelling the family stories that had become legend. Sam made a toast praising his parents' long and happy marriage. Maggie, now a grandmother herself, embarrassed everyone by telling the story of how her parents had met during a blizzard and fallen in love over darning lessons. James had painted a portrait of them that he unveiled to much applause. Clara gave them a photo album she had compiled, filled with pictures spanning half a century. Thomas assured them that the business they had founded was thriving and would continue to do so for generations. When the party finally wound down and the last guests departed, Lucas and Delilah found themselves alone again, exhausted but happy. They sat on their front porch in the warm summer darkness, holding hands and watching fireflies dance in the yard. 51 years, Delilah said softly. Can you believe it? Barely, Lucas admitted. It went by so fast. I feel like I was just a young cowboy stumbling through your door in a snowstorm. You were just a young cowboy stumbling through my door, and now you are an old cowboy sitting on a porch with his old wife. You are not old, Lucas protested. You are exactly as beautiful as the day I met you. Liar, Delilah said fondly, but I love you for saying it. I am not lying. You are beautiful to me, Delilah. You always have been, you always will be. And I am grateful, so grateful, for every single day I have been given with you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the night sounds of summer, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves. Finally, Delilah stood and tugged gently on Lucas's hand. Come to bed, she said. I am tired and you must be too. They went inside together, Lucas's arm around Delilah's waist, her head on his shoulder. They climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 51 years, moving slowly but together, always together. They prepared for bed with the easy intimacy of a lifetime, and when they finally lay down, Lucas pulled Delilah close, fitting her body against his in the way they had done thousands of times before. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I love you too, she whispered back. Forever. Lucas Kane died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, his heart simply stopping in the early morning hours. He was 75 years old. Delilah woke to find him gone, and though the grief hit her like a physical blow, there was also a strange sense of peace. They had been given 51 years together, more than many people got, and every one of those years had been good. He had kept his promise to keep her warm for life, and she had kept hers to darn his socks. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Bozeman. Lucas had been well loved in the community, respected for his business acumen, and admired for his devotion to family. His children spoke about what a wonderful father he had been, teaching them to work hard but also to laugh, to be self-sufficient but also to ask for help when needed. His grandchildren shared memories of his kindness and humor. And Gil's grandson, now an old man himself, told the story he had heard about how Lucas Kane had given up the traveling cowboy life to stay in one place and darned socks because he had fallen in love with a remarkable woman. Delilah stood through it all with dry eyes and a straight back, supported by her children on either side. She had cried privately in the days before the funeral and would cry again in the days after. But for this moment, she chose to celebrate rather than mourn, to remember the joy rather than focus on the loss. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it simple. "Lucas was my husband, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He was a good man who lived a good life. He kept every promise he ever made to me, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die. I will miss him every moment of every day for whatever time I have left. But I will not be sad, because how can I be sad about something so beautiful as what we shared? He gave me 51 years of happiness. That is a gift beyond measure." She lived for 7 more years after Lucas passed, years that were harder and lonelier than any that had come before. But she remained active and engaged, spending time with her children and grandchildren, maintaining her friendships, even occasionally helping out at the family business when Thomas needed an extra pair of hands. She never remarried, never even considered it. She had found her great love, and one was enough for a lifetime. On a cold February morning in 1937, Delilah Rose Kane passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 77. Her children found her the next day, lying peacefully in the bed she had shared with Lucas for most of her adult life, a small smile on her face. In her hands, clutched gently against her chest, was a pair of socks, the ones Lucas had darned for her on their 20th anniversary, worn thin now with age but still perfectly mended, still whole. She was buried next to Lucas in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Bozeman, their graves side by side, their headstones simple but elegant. The inscription on hers reads simply, "Delilah Rose Kane, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she darned socks and mended hearts." At her funeral, which was as well attended as Lucas's had been, Sam told the story that had become family legend, about the blizzard and the darning lessons and the promise that had changed 2 lives. He told his own children and grandchildren, and they told theirs, so that the story of Lucas and Delilah lived on, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when it was built on friendship and respect and practical promises faithfully kept. The business they had started together continued to thrive under Thomas's management and eventually passed to his children and then his grandchildren. The house they had shared and expanded was sold after Delilah's death, but remained standing, a landmark in Bozeman's history. And somewhere in that house, preserved in a box by one of Delilah's great-grandchildren, were the socks Lucas had mended on their anniversary, a tangible reminder of a love that had endured through 5 decades, through hard times and good, through the raising of children and the building of a business and the simple daily choice to keep showing up for each other. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually number in the dozens, spreading across the country, but many of them returned to Bozeman to visit the graves and hear the stories, and learn about the cowboy who had given up traveling to darn socks for the woman he loved, and the woman who had built a life and a business and a legacy from that simple, practical promise. The story changed slightly with each telling, details added or forgotten, but the heart of it remained true. That love, when it is genuine and worked at daily, when it is both practical and romantic, can create something that lasts far beyond a single lifetime. And so the story of Lucas and Delilah lived on, a testament to the power of promises kept, of work shared, of warmth given and received, and of 2 people who found each other in a blizzard and chose, every day for 51 years, to keep choosing each other. It was not a grand love story in the way of legends and fairy tales. There were no dramatic rescues or impossible obstacles overcome. It was simply 2 people who met, fell in love, built a life together through hard work and mutual respect and unwavering commitment, and found happiness in the everyday moments that make up a marriage. That was the true legacy they left behind, more valuable than the business they founded, or the house they built, or the children they raised. They left the knowledge that love does not have to be complicated to be profound, that the most meaningful promises are often the simplest ones, and that sometimes the greatest adventure is not in traveling the world, but in staying in one place with one person and building something beautiful together, stitch by careful stitch, day by patient day, until a life has been made that was worth living and a love has been created that was worth remembering. Their graves on the hill overlooking Bozeman stood as a quiet monument to that truth, visited by family and strangers alike who came to pay respects or simply to sit for a while in the presence of something good and true and lasting. And if you sat there quietly on a summer evening as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, you might almost hear the echo of their voices on the wind, laughing together over some long-forgotten joke, or murmuring words of love in the darkness, or simply sitting in companionable silence. Two souls who had found their home in each other and never needed to wander again.